Ina waka, ina reo, ina mana, tēnā koutou katoa. E te hapori o Kirikiri Roa, i te rohi whānui no mai haramai o te pariwana o Waikato. Nā ahorangi, nā kai āpau, nā kai mahi, me te tauira hoki. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Alistair Jones and I'm the Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, and it's my real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for Professor Ross Lawrenson's inaugural lecture. He's probably given a few in other different places as well. But it's a real pleasure for you to join us this evening. Professorial lectures are an important part of the life of an institution. It's always wonderful to welcome new professors who, though are familiar with us and worked with us for a long time, are also joining the staff. So thank you for joining us tonight and acknowledging Ross Lawrenson's appointment as Professor of Population Health in NIDIA. Ross joined the university in April in a joint appointment with the Waikato District Health Board as its Clinical Director, Strategy and Funding. With a background in general practice, public health, Ross has more than 20 years of academic research and teaching experience. Ross has a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, Doctor of Medicine from London University, a Diploma of Community Health from the University of Otago. He is a Fellow of the Australasian Faculty of Public Health Medicine and a Fellow of the Royal College of General Practitioners and the UK Faculty of Public Health. He worked as a house surgeon in Tikawiti Hospital and then as a GP in Wairoa before moving back to the Waikato, where he was involved in hospital management from 1988 to 1995. He then returned to the UK, where he began a series of teaching roles as a senior lecturer in public health at Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School and the University of Surrey. In 2000, he was appointed Dean and Head of Postgraduate Medical School at the University of Surrey and Professor of Primary Health Care. Coming back to New Zealand in 2005, Ross was appointed Head of the Waikato Clinical School and Professor of Primary Care at the University of Auckland until his appointment at the University of Waikato this year. Ross has published more than 250 academic articles and abstracts, including in The Lancet, British Medical Journal, British Journal of General Practice, Family Practice, and Primary Care Diabetes. Throughout his career, he has received millions of dollars worth of funding to assist research into a variety of areas, including health outcomes for cancer patients, primary care for Māori and Pacific, and palliative care in rural New Zealand. He has been on a number of health boards and committees, including the New Zealand Guidelines Group, the Ministry of Health's Cancer Registry Board, and the New Zealand Institute of Rural Health. He is currently chair of the National Screening Advisory Committee, a board member of the New Zealand Rural GP Network, and a member of the Ministry's Cancer Health Information Strategy Governance Board and Prostate Cancer Task Force. Please welcome to the stage Professor Ross Lawrenson to give his inaugural lecture.
Ina reo, ina mana, ina karangatanga mana, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, Dean Hannah, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along tonight to hear my talk on medical education that has been highlighted by the title that you have there. Generally, inaugural lectures are about people's research history, and I've certainly spent the last 20 years of my academic life researching health service outcomes, particularly as Alistair has said, around diabetes and cancer outcomes. But my other passion has been around medical education and the importance of that to helping develop the workforce of the future. So that's what I want to talk to tonight. Particularly, I wanted to say a little bit about my own history in medical education. I want to talk about the history of medical education in general, because I think it's important to get an understanding of the hierarchy, if you like, of medical education. I'll talk a little bit about medical education in New Zealand, and then talk about some of the workforce challenges that we are facing at the moment, and hopefully just briefly talk about some of the possible solutions that we would like to look at. So I trained at the Royal Free Hospital in London. We were one of 12 medical schools at that time. 10 of those were independent medical schools working with hospitals, and only 2 of them were attached to universities. We had 70 students in each year. It was the Royal Free Hospital School for medical school for women, and only allowed men in the 1950s. And so all of our eminent professors like Dame Sheila Sherlock and Dame Josephine Barnes were our senior academics. The rugby photograph is the first question you were asked when you arrived was, what position do you play? Because the inter-hospital rugby cup was a very important part of the program. One of the other interesting things was when I qualified, you qualified as MBBS from the University of London, or you could go off and do your College of Surgeons or College of Physicians exams, or even the LSA with the Society of Apothecaries. And that was a very useful backup, because if you failed your final exams, you could still go and work as a house surgeon and never actually take the final exams. And that's relevant later on when I talk about that. I then did my general practice training and then spent time in Te Kuiti, as Alistair has mentioned, which really was what attracted me back to New Zealand. We were the first students, or the first house surgeons to use the new accommodation block that John Mandano had so thoughtfully built and provided. And it was there that I published my first academic paper on obstetric services 1971 to 1980. Following that, as has been said, I went to Waikato, where I started off as a general practitioner, but also became the medical superintendent, and had our last child, Stephen, who was a baby there and is far too old for me to remember. But I did spend 5 years in Waikato, worked with the Hawke's Bay Hospital Board, and then came back to Waikato in 1988. And there I worked with Rex Wright-Sinclair, who was a noted medical academic, particularly expert on medical history, but also well-published community physician and public health doctor. And again, Rex encouraged me to be involved in a small way in academia. And later I was involved in the setting up of the diabetes program for the Waikato, which led to my MD thesis on screening for undiagnosed diabetes in the Waikato. Susie and Brian will hate me for putting that photograph up, but thank you to Susie, who actually did most of the work on that program. After being reorganised 3 times in 7 years and restructured, I thought I would escape the restructuring and took a job to write up my MD in London and went to Charing Cross and Westminster Medical School. And I've been there for about 9 months when I was told that we were about to be restructured. And we were merged with Imperial College of Medicine, with the St Mary's Medical School and the Royal Postgraduate Medical School at Hammersmith. And that was a really interesting time, because I spent 2.5 years on curriculum committees developing a new curriculum for what is now probably the leading scientific-based university medical school in the UK, along with Oxford and Cambridge. And we had a very intensive 6-year program, which was, as I said, very scientifically based. During the restructuring, we were invited to move our department to the University of Surrey, and it was there that we set up a postgraduate medical school. We have the Vice Chancellor there, Patrick Darley, Professor of Diabetes, David Russell-Jones, and myself. And we had a whole list of research that we were involved in undertaking, and also set up a number of postgraduate programs for doctors in the area. The other escapade was the building of the new postgraduate medical school building, which certainly is not something that people want to get involved in if they can avoid it at all costs, so try to keep everybody happy with a new building. But the intent was always to come back to New Zealand, and in 2005 I came back to the Waikato as head of the Waikato Clinical Campus, and later retitled Assistant Dean. So while at Waikato, we set up the Waikato weekend, which is now Tukuiti weekend, for rural medical students from Auckland, which is very much valued part of the calendar. I set up here with Joe Scott Jones the Rural Interprofessional Program that is run through Whakatane, which involves interprofessional learning with nurses, allied health and pharmacy students. And was also involved in the development of the Public Health Intensive Program and delivering the reinvigorated curriculum. So there's been a lot of academic involvement in development of new curriculums over my career. What about the history of medical Western medicine? Well, we go back to Hippocrates, and the learnings in the 4th century BC really trace a lot of the basis of the Hippocratic Oath, which is still taken by medical students today. We have there the rod of Asclepius surrounded by a snake. And from the Greeks, we then go to the Romans, and Claudius Galen was one of the greatest writers in the Roman Empire on medicine. He learned his anatomy because he was the surgeon to the gladiator school, as well as being the physician to Marcus Aurelius. And I've always wondered why Ridley Scott didn't actually put Galen into the Gladiator movie. Something that should really have been there, because he was one of the most famous physicians of that era. But of course, at the end of the Roman Empire, we lost a lot of the learnings from the Roman Empire, and actually the weight of medical learning moved to the Muslim world. The writings of Al-Razi and others Al-Razi gave particular descriptions of smallpox, measles, thyroidectomy, and all of those learnings for the next 300 or 400 years, when most of Europe was in what was called the Dark Ages. And it really wasn't until the 11th century when there was a revival in the learning of both the Roman and Arabic literature into the universities. And here we have a picture of a university lecturer reading aloud the scripts of Galen, Al-Razi and others. And for the next 400 or 500 years, physicians learnt by rote their instruction in medicine, and came out qualified from the great universities of Southern Europe, Salerno, Padua, Montpellier, and later Oxford and Cambridge. And it was really those physicians from those universities that set up the first College of Physicians in 1518, which were given a grant by Henry VIII to control all of medicine in London, and then in 1573 were given control of medical practice right throughout England at that time. And so the College of Physicians really controlled the role of medicine, and essentially you had to have qualified from Oxford or Cambridge to become a fellow of the college, or if you qualified from another university, then you could become a licentiate. There were other health practitioners at the time, and lower down the order were the barber surgeons who formed their guild in 1540. And the surgeons did lots of practical things like couching for cataracts of the eye, or trephining, or cutting for stone in the lithotomy position, which must have been a very painful exercise, but seems to have been a very common surgical procedure at the time. But the lowest rank, if you like, were the apothecaries, who were the shopkeepers who provided prescriptions on the prescription of a physician, and so were allowed to dispense their tinctures and other medicines, but only, as I say, on the license of a physician, very much like the pharmacists of today. And it's from the apothecaries that the role of the general practitioner really got established. Medical training really took off in the late 18th and early 19th century with the development of the teaching hospitals. And it was the great teachers of the day, Sir Astley Cooper, the great surgeon at Guy's Hospital, Thomas Addison, who named Addison's disease, or tuberculosis of the adrenal glands, Percival Potts from Bart's Hospital, who Potts fracture and Potts disease of the spine, and the great anatomist and surgeon John Hunter from St George's. All of these doyens of medicine would charge students a fee to come and learn at their feet and to walk the wards of those hospitals and get practical experience of medicine. The apothecaries were feeling a little left out by all of this, and so in 1815 they appealed to Parliament to also be allowed to train and examine students, and the Apothecaries Act of 1815 allowed them to set up their own examinations. So by 1858 there were a whole plethora of qualifications available for doctors working in the United Kingdom at the time. You could have your licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians, the LRCP, which, as I say, lots of my colleagues were still taking in the 1970s, MRCS from surgeons, the LSA from the Apothecaries Hall, or the one that we all really love, you could get a doctorate in medicine granted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think that's still on the statute. So we can see that by this time in Victorian England there were a plethora of hospitals, particularly in London, that were offering medical training, and it was a very practical apprenticeship walking the wards of the hospitals. The Americans went into the same sorts of programs, and by the end of the 19th century there were over 150 medical schools of very variable quality in the United States, to the extent that some were granted medical degrees after only 2 years of study. And because of the variation in qualifications, there was the Flexner Report of 1910, commissioned by the Carnegie Institute to look into the aspects of medical training. And this report has had a tremendous impact on medical training in New Zealand and the world ever since. And Flexner essentially said that we should reduce the number of medical schools, increase the prerequisites to enter medical training. But it was this sentence here about train physicians to practice in a scientific manner and engage medical faculties in research, and also to give medical schools control of clinical instruction in hospitals. So that really had, as I say, an impact not only in the United States but worldwide on how people thought medicine should be, medical education should be followed. There have since then been some advances or some changes to medical education. This is Professor David Sackett, who I attended one of his courses at Oxford University back in 1995. And he was one of the doyens of evidence-based medicine and problem-based learning that came out of McMaster in the 1960s, and that has had a big influence in the last 20 or 30 years on medical education and a number of new curriculum worldwide. And what we are interested in today is the idea of community-engaged medical education. And this is Professor Paul Worley from Flinders University, who set up the Riverland experiment, where they took students for 1 year of their medical program into general practice. And Paul showed that actually at the end of their 12 months in general practice, the students scored higher in their fifth year exams than did those that had the traditional program. And so he established the validity of a different way of training. And that has now spread to a number of other university medical schools in Australia, to the Northern Ontario School of Medicine in Canada, and to university medical schools in Europe, in the UK and Portugal in particular. So what about medical training in New Zealand? Back in the 19th century, all of our doctors were imported, and they were a fairly variable bunch. So we have William Crocombe from Waikato, who was a surgeon on a sailing boat, got shipwrecked off Dunedin and ended up in Waikato for the rest of his life. Featherstone, who came out with the New Zealand Society to Port Nicholson, and became a very famous local politician. Arthur Guyon Purchase, who came out as a missionary in the manner of David Livingstone, was a medical missionary, or Thomas Moore Filson, who the Filson Library is named after, who came out of the British Army. So a whole ragbag of different doctors who came out at that time. But Otago did set up their university medical school very early on in 1875. and their Professor of Anatomy in 1877 was John Scott Halliday, who then became the first Dean of the medical school. And they were instructing students for 2 years in science before those students then had to go off to Edinburgh for their clinical training. And it wasn't until 1885 that students were allowed to do all of their medical training in New Zealand. This is Levingham Christie, who was the first medical student to qualify as a fully qualified medical practitioner from New Zealand. But it's the great Lindo Ferguson, who was the Dean in 1914 to 1937, that really established Otago Medical School as it is in many ways today. So he moved the curriculum from a 4-year program to a 6-year program, 3 years of basic sciences, followed by 3 years of clinical practice. He built the great clinical sciences building to house all of that clinical instruction, and very much set the tone of the Flexnerian model of science-based, research-led medical education. Charles Hercus was the next Dean, and with the rapid expansion of the numbers of medical students, he set up campuses in Auckland, Christchurch and Wellington, and also introduced the idea of the first-year pre-medical admission, so taking medical students into the second year of the program to deal with great numbers of people applying to enter the medical program at the time. But there was pressure for a second medical school at that time, and indeed a third medical school, and we have notes from the University of Waikato in 1970 that were competing with Auckland to set up a medical school. But the Auckland Medical School was set up with the support of Sir Brian Robb and Sir Douglas Robb and many of the doyens of medical practice in Auckland in the 1960s, and opened its doors in 1968 to take 60 medical students into their 6-year program modelled on that of Otago. And of course the Otago outpost closed in Auckland to allow the medical program to exist. Probably their greatest achievement was setting up the Waikato Academical Centre with Peter Gluckman, now Professor Sir Peter Gluckman, the Chief Science Advisor, who was Dean of the Medical School at the time, Tony Carl, the Chief Executive, and Peter Rothwell, who was the first head of the Academic Centre that has now become a clinical campus today. And in those days they took 24 of the 106 trainee interns into the program on a cohort basis. Now there are something like 120 students a year going to Waikato. So let me get back to, we have seen what the medical programs are doing today. We have highly scientifically based programs at the 2 medical schools, but we still have the problem of maldistribution of our doctors and also shortages in particular specialties, not only in rural general practice, but in many of our hospital specialties as well. And we are facing a number of issues around our workforce. There is an increasing population. We will be 5 million people in New Zealand by 2025, and maybe 6 million by 2050. But we also have a rapidly ageing population, and by 2030 there will be 1 million people over the age of 65 requiring health services. And it's because of that changing demographic that this is the population growth since 2000, around 15%, but this is the growth in medical doctor numbers over that same period of time to meet the increasing demand on the medical system. But at the same time, we started a primary care strategy around 2000, and this is a proportion of our medical workforce that has gone into general practice. And so we have a dilemma where we are looking to provide more community-based medical care, and yet our proportion of doctors in general practice is shrinking. And we can see this also. This is the output of the medical schools from Otago in blue and Auckland in red, that in the 1990s, something like 45% of doctors who were qualified went into general practice, but that has been steadily shrinking down to now around 15% of our medical output from the 2 medical schools are going into general practice. And this is the Auckland numbers, and we can see from 1999 less than 10% of male medical students have been going into general practice, and around 20% of those who qualified from Auckland who are female have been going into general practice. So there's a real change in the ambitions of our medical graduates. I think the other thing that we need to take into account, and as an international medical graduate myself, it's really important to understand that we import into this country 1,200 international doctors a year to meet the health needs of the population. This is a WHO report from 2008 pointing out that we're the most heavily dependent country on overseas trained doctors in the OECD, but also that we have high migration rates of those doctors, and that the sustainability of our health service is very dependent on our ability to track overseas doctors. And this is the proportion of international medical graduates in our rural areas, well over 50%, whereas in our urban areas, a lesser proportion of international medical graduates. So the graduates that we're training are not going into general practice, and they are tending to stay in the urban areas. But depending on international medical graduates is not sustainable. The majority, 30%, will have left within 3 years, so they're coming for short-term stays, and overall only 1 in 5 of those international medical graduates will stay working in New Zealand. So as I say, it's not just in general practice that this causes issues. We have shortages in psychiatry, in geriatrics, in palliative care and rehabilitation medicine. All of those specialties where there's not a large private practice have a shortage of specialists available from the current medical training programs, and so are reliant on those overseas trained doctors. So are there any solutions to these problems? Well, I go back to the idea that has been proposed in Australia and Canada of the community engaged medical program. I've been saying for a number of years that if you want to train people for the rural areas of New Zealand, that we have the wrong sorts of students into the program, we have the wrong curriculum, and we train them in the wrong place. And unless we change that, then there's going to be a continuing problem. So one of the things that we're very keen to do is to try and encourage graduates into the program, and more graduates who come into medical programs tend to go more likely to go into general practice or the specialties that I've mentioned. There is evidence to show that if we take graduates from the communities that they're going to serve, they're more likely to go back to those communities. And the community engaged programs in Australia and Canada, it actually involves the community in the selection of students into their programs, rather than leaving it to academics to decide on who's appropriate. There is the issue around the curriculum, and this is a traditional Auckland curriculum with lots of short runs in highly specialised areas. So this is the Northern Ontario curriculum, where all of the students spend 1 year in a rural community engaged program. And so that gives them time to get adjusted and become useful working in that environment. Roger Strasser, the Dean of that medical school, will say that it's not so much what the doctors in that community can teach the students, but it's what the patients teach them that is important. And finally, where should we be placing our students? Should all of their training be done in large tertiary institutions? Or this is the clinical campus at Whakatane, where we were running our rural immersion program, and certainly the students very much appreciated the opportunities to work there, and they liked working in that environment. I think the other thing that I wanted to stress was that the Northern Ontario model in particular talks about the campus of the medical school being the whole community, not the hospital, and that all of the communities are engaged in the program. And I was recently in Northern Ontario, and you talk to the taxi drivers or people in the